Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Electromagnetic Compatibility and Radio Compliance for Medical Devices. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. Now, this chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Element, who developed the content for this presentation. Overcome tough challenges and gain faster market access with Element's advanced testing equipment and team of connected technology experts. Manufacturers of connected devices ensure compliance with regulations and reduce service failures with Element's world-leading testing, inspection, and certification services. Develop better systems and components for the next generation devices, and bring products to market faster with fast turnaround times and best-in-class service when you partner with Element. Element provides end-to-end technical consulting and regulatory support from prototype to commercialization, and encompasses advisory, testing, certification, and inspection for carrier, industry, and government approvals and global market access support. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for today's webinar, and he is David Schaefer. He is an EMC Technical Manager for Element Materials Technologies Connected Technologies and Mobility Business Unit. He graduated from North Dakota State University with a degree in electrical engineering and has nearly 20 years experience in EMC radio and product compliance. Now it's my pleasure to pass the mic and the controls over to David. So David, when you're ready, you may begin.
Okay, Sonia, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sonia, for that kind introduction. So today I'm going to talk about EMC and radio compliance for medical devices. I'm going to start with an overview of basic medical EMC, focused on IAC 60601-1-2 and risk management, then cover the requirements for connected medical devices with radios. Then we'll finish with a discussion of some of the recent trends and emerging topics in medical device EMC. So for a quick introduction to Element, for those who are not familiar with us, Element Materials Technology is one of the largest independent providers of materials and product testing services worldwide. We provide high-value critical services to aerospace, transportation, life sciences, and connected technology sectors. And we have EMC test labs across the USA and worldwide that can help you with medical device EMC. So I think next we have a poll to get started. Sonia?
Yes, we do, and I will launch that poll question right now. So audience members, this is done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. It's a simple poll that we have for you. How well do you understand EMC and radio compliance regulations for medical devices? Is it A, I know very little, or I understand the basics, or I am reasonably comfortable, or I am an expert? So please go ahead and cast your vote. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds as it looks like we have the majority of our audience are now participating in this. I'm going to leave it open for a few more of our members to jump in. Okay, and that looks like it's almost everyone. Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in poll question number 1. I'm now going to close the polls, and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so here are the results, David. We have in our audience 43% that chose I know very little, while 39% said I understand the basics. Then we have 13% that said I am reasonably comfortable, and then only 4% said I'm an expert. So thank you everyone for participating in our first poll. Now back to you, David.
Well, excellent. Thank you very much, Sonia. Yeah, so this presentation is aimed more at those with lesser understanding and not experts, but hopefully everyone that is on today can glean some information from my presentation. So, medical device advances that are saving lives every day rely on proper operation in their electromagnetic environment. And every year there are hundreds, possibly thousands of incidences of EMI in healthcare. So the FDA has a database, the MAUDE database, that tracks medical device malfunctions. And it, last time I checked, had 250,000 reports of issues due to EMC. So, and between 2010 and 2019, there were 170 reports of deaths due to issues due to EMC, ESD, or wireless malfunctions. Manufacturers are increasingly using wireless technologies for mission critical functions, safety functions, and proper operation is vital for patient safety. So what are some of the radio technologies that are in use in the healthcare field? Medical devices are using inductive radios for active implantable device communication. You've got the mix and med radios band, the 400 megahertz band, the ISM, industrial, scientific, and medical bands, 13.56, 2.4 gigahertz, and so on. And then short-range devices are very common. So short-range devices are going to include things like LoRa and Zigbee, and also Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. There's a growing use of cellular, particularly 5G with the high bandwidth. And these technologies are being used, things like 5G are being used for virtual and remote doctor visits. This was critical during COVID to allow, proper health care for people that were not able to leave the house or were not able to get to a doctor during the pandemic. Diagnostic imaging and health record access are other applications that are being used for medical devices that have implemented radio technology. So this is definitely a growing area of concern. And so what are we really talking about? We're talking about compliance. So compliance, there are two main areas of compliance, two main goals for compliance. The first is quality. You want to make a quality product. You want to sell something that is, you're not going to have field failures and return costs. You're not going to have safety risks to the user or patient, and basically just make a good product. Then the other side of that is market entry, which is meeting the requirements to sell a product into a country or a region. So there are compliance marks required or encouraged for use across the world from national regulators like the FCC certification, international bodies like the European Union and CE marking, and then there's also certification marks from companies like those for the nationally recognized test lab program, the NRTL lab. Understanding these requirements is critical to successful product launch. So we'll start talking about 60601-1-2. So the 60601 series starts with the -1. It is a primary standard related to medical devices, and the 60601 series is broken up with the -1 is focused on electrical safety and is the basis of the entire series. 60601 is then split up into the -1-X and -2-X series of standards. The -1-X standards are collateral standards. Basically, they cover classes of products that are more general. So you can see a list there that are going to include things like usability, alarms, and then different environments, so home healthcare versus emergency medical environments. The -2s are particular standards. They're for specific product types like ultrasonic devices, pulse oximeters, things like that. Also be aware that you might see standards 80601 standards. These are standards that are created in collaboration between IEC and ISO, but they're basically the same concept. They're focused on medical and they're particular standards. So you might see 80601-2-47. And with the structure of 60601, all products need to apply any applicable -1-X collateral standards, and for any electronic devices, that means 60601-1-2 in particular. -1-2 is the EMC standard for medical devices. So while 60601-1-2 is focused on EMC, it really is a safety standard. And so the testing inside, the requirements, what level you're supposed to meet, they're for EMC, But the title of the standard, the focus of the standard is basic safety and essential performance. Really, the idea is it wants the users of the standard need to maintain basic safety and essential performance for their medical devices. So the previous editions of 60601 were EMC standards. They focused on EMC, whereas this most recent edition, edition 4, and then with Amendment 1, so edition 4.1, it is a safety standard. Radios are mentioned as potential RF threats, and there is a clause on addressing emissions from radios in the medical device, but it does not directly address radios in the standard. So there are 7 base immunity tests in 60601-1-2 that nearly every product is going to need. Electrostatic discharge, rated and conducted RF immunity, electrically fast transients, voltage surge, power frequency mag field, and voltage dips and interruptions. There's also ISO 7637-2, which is voltage transients in the automotive environment. So that's anything that's going to be plugged into DC power in an automobile and connected basically to that battery. Emissions is primarily covered by radiated and conducted emissions per EN 55011 or CISPR 11, and then there's flicker and harmonics. If the medical product is used in other special environments, additional tests may also be required. So a medevac helicopter would be an example of a hostile EM environment not covered by the normal immunity test. And then additionally, special environments like aircraft or vehicles, you need to address additional emissions. So for aircraft, you might need to do emissions to RTCA DO-160, which is for commercial aircraft, or CISPR 25 for automotive environments. And Annex E of the 60601-1-2 talks about these special immunity levels for special environments and how to determine what's needed. And then a key concept for all medical devices is risk management. So ISO 14971 is the key standard for risk management, the risk management process for medical devices. So risk management, basically what you're doing for risk management is identifying and now analyzing, evaluating, and prioritizing current and potential risks. So you start with the risk assessment, which helps you identify and categorize the risks. And it provides an outline for potential consequences. Essentially, if there is an issue, what's going to happen. So you need to identify critical aspects and sensitive data, build a risk profile for each use case, and determine risks for errors, misuse, software, or firmware problems. You also then need to map how critical portions of the device are linked. For example, if you've got a system that has a half dozen different components in it, you need to look at risks for each of those individual components, how all the different components interact with the whole, and then how the whole system is intended to operate. So you've really got 3 levels of risk analysis there. And risk analysis is crucial for the evaluation of components within the broader risk management and assessment process. So risk analysis, you're determining the significance of identified risk factors and identifying that you identified in the risk management process. It also qualifies the risks, things like measuring the likelihood of a hazard occurring and tolerances for certain events. In 60601, Annex F covers risk management and is focused on that basic safety and essential performance. So while 60601 talks about risk and basic safety and essential performance, what are those? So basic safety is essentially that the product or system remains safe to use for the patient and operator and bystanders, even during a fault. So, an example of this is I tested an implantable defibrillator to AAMI TIR69 dipole testing for immunity to cellular signals. And during this test, this implantable defibrillator unintentionally shocked. So that could definitely cause a safety issue both during installation of the product to the doctors and nurses, and then also to the patient during their normal daily activities being unintentionally shocked. That's a critical safety issue. So on the other side then is essential performance. Essential performance covers the functions of the system. Does a pacemaker keep pacing? Does an ablation generator deliver therapy? Would a risk to the health of the patient occur if the performance was degraded? So For some medical devices, immunity tests may need to be run twice, once to monitor basic safety and once to monitor essential performance. So here's a real-life example for a non-medical device. This is something that actually happened over in Denmark a few years back. So a toaster was plugged into the AC mains, and toasters used to be basically just a giant resistor, but now they have digital logic in there. It was plugged in the mains, and a nearby thermostat kicked on. Well, the thermostat caused transients on the mains, and the toaster saw that as a signal to be turned on, and it powered on and ended up causing a house fire. So there, the essential performance of the toaster might be considered making toast, being able to toast bread, but it did not mean basic safety, causing a fire there. So you've got, what's it supposed to be doing and making sure it doesn't actually cause harm. So in addition to 60601-1-2 and any of the particular -2 standards, one more item should be looked at. So IEC TR60601-4-2, it's not strictly a standard, it's a technical report. That's why it's IEC TR. It's a technical report for electromagnetic immunity for medical devices. So it is on the FDA consensus standards list, and FDA reviewers are asking for testing to it. So what is it? Essentially, 4-2 has all the same immunity tests as -1-2, but with a different focus. The idea is that while basic safety and essential performance cover the aspects of a product that have the highest risk to the patient, some functions, the intended use of the product, are not covered by -1-2. So we'll take the previous example of the toaster. So assuming the safety issue with causing a fire was fixed, a manufacturer might say that the toaster doesn't have essential performance. As long as it's safe, it's fine, we'll test it. We don't have to know if it's going to toast or not. And that might be perfectly reasonable. Maybe toasting isn't an essential function, or isn't considered essential performance. The concern, though, is that users of, if it was a medical device, users of the medical device still expected to perform basic functions, in this case, toasting. And that is its intended use. What is it supposed to be able to do outside these essential performance criteria? So 4-2 is a companion technical report that covers immunity testing for these other functions. So you might think you're ready to test, and then a test lab asks you, do you have a test plan? So what's a test plan, and what is needed in a test plan? So a test plan basically lays out, what is the goal of your testing, details of your device, and then what if there's any special additional additions, changes to the base standards. So IEC 60601-1-2 Annex G covers what is required in a test plan, and in -4-2 it's clause 6.1. So some of the key points are, the description of the basic safety and essential performance. Those are the things you're supposed to be monitoring, that you're really focusing on during the -1-2 testing. What are they, and how are you going to make sure that they're being maintained? Similarly, for -4-2, if you're testing to that, you need to have a description of the intended use. You should include any particular standard. So, if it's a pulse oximeter, if it's a infusion pump, whatever, you need to make sure that there's a particular standard that you're addressing any additional requirements in there. And then layout and configuration. How is the product going to be set up? How is it being run and exercised during the testing? And then also be aware that, -4-2, because you're monitoring intended use versus the basic safety and essential performance, you may need to do each immunity test more than once to cover that, cover the different use case. So it's also important to examine the risk for all potential modes of operation and consider testing them. So an example, think of an ablation generator. There's a risk if it turns off during a procedure, so testing should likely be done with ablation active. But on the other hand, the risk of harm is even higher if it turns on when it isn't supposed to. So you really should be looking at two different use cases to maintain that basic safety and essential performance, and then potentially a third test run to look at the intended use under 4-2. So these are all things you need to look at during your risk analysis and risk assessment to see what makes sense, what should be required, what is going to prevent harm, and address these risk factors. So when you're integrating a radio in the EU, for the EU, the EU's Radio Equipment Directive requires immunity testing, which should also be then included in the test plan. So -1, -2, and 31489 reference the same basic methods as shown here. You can see that they're almost identical in terms of what they're referencing. But the modes of operation and acceptable criteria is based on the risk management aspects. So 31489 is looking for simple radio functionality, while -1, -2 is, again, looking at essential performance and basic safety. These are different things, and you shouldn't, and they shouldn't be confused. Another thing to note, that limits may be different between the standards. -1, -2 only requires emissions above 1 gigahertz for group 2 devices, but with 31489, if it since you're including a radio, if there's a clock greater than 108 megahertz or a signal internal to the product greater than 108 megahertz, say Bluetooth radio, Wi-Fi radio, emissions testing needs to go above 1 gigahertz. So you need to make sure that you're meeting all the limits required for a product. So when you're, again, looking at what you're going to include in a test plan, you're potentially looking at 3 different focuses and 3 different standards, each focusing on different areas. So the -1, -2 only focuses on testing for essential performance and basic safety as defined in 60601-1. If a medical device does not have any functions which are deemed to be essential, then -4, -2 might be more appropriate for some of them. And then -4, -2, as we said, is about the usability of the device, not essential performance. So if a device doesn't have patient critical items identified under essential performance, you still need to think about monitoring them during testing. And then 31489 addresses radio performance. So all devices that incorporate a radio fall under the Radio Equipment Directive for the EU and need to be evaluated for the performance of that radio. So for 31489, the primary concerns are that the radio doesn't unintentionally transmit, change stored data, or change its mode of operation. And this also does mean that if you've got a product with multiple radios, each one needs to be evaluated during testing. So for example, if you've got a product with Wi-Fi and RFID, both need to be active and monitored. If they can't both be active and monitored at the same time, you need to be testing them separately. So you need to do one test run with the Wi-Fi active, one test run with the RFID. So another aspect for medical device EMC is the AIM 7351731. It's a susceptibility test method for immunity to RFID signals. So it covers both H field and E fields for RFID frequencies. And for obviously people in the medical device field are aware, RFID is everywhere. Clinics, hospitals, home. It is being used to track just about everything. And so this was a test method developed by AAM to address that risk. It's an FDA-recognized consensus standard, but 60601-1-2, the 4th edition didn't address RFID at all. The Amendment A1 did include testing for magnetic fields of lower frequencies, but we've seen some. So the idea is, if you're testing to edition 4.1, you don't need to test for AIM as well. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this is not just a test to do a test. There is a known issue, a documented issue from a few years back, where magnetic instrument mats, which are being used in an operating room, were interfering with RFID tagged surgical sponges. So they've got the RFID for the surgical sponges to track what's going in and out of the patient during surgery, which is can be health critical. And the RFID was being screwed up by a magnetic instrument mat. So this is something that definitely is a concern. It can happen, and that's why we've got the test. Okay, so integrating a radio. You decided you want to have radio functionality in your product. What do you need to do? So first off, we're really talking about 2 parts: the radio and the medical product. The medical device is going to be called the host device that's integrating the radio. So what do you need to do? First, you need to make sure you comply with EMC requirements, but then you need to start looking at the applicable radio requirements for all the countries sold into. So, you know, we already covered the 60601 and 30149 for EMC, and then you need to do radio testing and approvals. So for the FCC and ISED, that's a certification for nearly all radios. I'm going to focus really just on FCC because ISED requirements are very similar. And then we're going to look, so we'll talk FCC and the European Union. So the FCC Code of Federal Regulations on radios is thousands of pages long, so we're just going to kind of talk at a high level here. And for the FCC, like I said, most radios require certification. The certification process involves getting approval through a telecommunications certification body at TCD, and the certification can be done as a system or a module. For the EU, they don't really have a certification, but you need to meet the Radio Equipment Directive in addition to the Medical Device Directive or Medical Device Regulation, MDR. So the EU doesn't require certification like the FCC, but there's still many things that need to be dealt with there. Under the red, there are type examination certificates. Type examination certificates involve taking a radio device to a notified body for approval, and this is required if there isn't a harmonized standard in the official journal for the red, and as well as some other instances, but that's kind of one of the key ones. Also be aware that the Radio Equipment Directive has safety requirements that refer back to the Low Voltage Directive, meaning tests like dielectric strength and leakage current need to be addressed. Those should already be taken care of by any testing you've done to IEC 60601-1. Might be aware that to meet the Radio Equipment Directive, that needs to be done. You also need to look at RF exposure, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. For if you're integrating a cellular device or cellular radio, you need to look at GCF and PTCRB approvals. These are essentially approvals to allow the cellular radio to be on a carrier's network. So AT&T, T-Mobile, et cetera. You're going to need to have these approvals to be able to get on, to actually use the cellular radio on these networks. Additionally, you need to do wireless coexistence, which we'll cover a little bit later in this presentation, and then properly label the product. You know, being medical device manufacturers, you're all familiar with medical device labeling, but adding a radio adds, you know, a bunch of potentially additional labeling requirements. So for the FCC, for example, if you've got a radio in there with an FCC ID, it's going to need to have a label that says contains FCC ID and then whatever the number is. And there's more information on the FCC's KDB 784748. So how do we actually do some of the approvals? Radios can be, for the FCC, radios can be certified as a modular or a system. Both meet the radio requirements, but they're doing it in different ways. Systems are fully complete radio products with radios. So an example of this is a pacemaker. It's a complete system. The radios are integrated in the pacemaker. Everything's tested together. It's a complete system. And you know, the system approval path can be the right path if you can't use modules due to design limitations. Again, a pacemaker, they're so cramped for space that you can't, they can't rely on another manufacturer to make the radio. If you're doing system approval, you also can do whatever, you know, basically whatever you want within the FCC or EU rules. You're not limited by the module manufacturer. You have the control over the design. System approval also tends to be cheaper on a per unit basis, but there's some economic considerations in there that, you know, won't go into today, but basically, you know, it might be cheaper on a per unit basis, but it depends on how many units you're doing and so on. And then another thing with system approval is not all regions accept modular approval, so you might need to certify as a system for certain markets. So radios can also be certified as modules, and when they're certified as modules, they're tested by the module manufacturer to meet the radio requirements. So basically, module receives modular approval, and their complexities we won't get into today, but the point of modular approval is that if a product manufacturer, in this case medical device manufacturers, integrates an approved radio, if you follow the grant conditions from the FCC and follow the integration instructions from the module manufacturer, no additional certification work will be required and only a minimal amount of testing if you follow those two items, the grant conditions and integration instructions. So Certified modules are typically going to be more expensive than those without certifications, but a cheaper uncertified module means you as the integrator need to do radio testing, and that might end up costing you more in the long run. So again, kind of that economic decision. You also will need to meet radio RF exposure, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And so a pre-approved module is a good solution, particularly for things like cellular radios. Cellular radios are very expensive to certify. And I honestly have never seen a product where, the host product manufacturer, the integrator, does the certification for a cellular radio. It's the chip makers are going to be the ones doing that. So the actual testing done on a radio is going to measure things like output power, duty cycle, occupied bandwidth, and receiver sensitivity, and more. So we're not going to go in depth on that. So RF exposure. So RF exposure essentially, how much RF is the user, nearby people, how much RF is going to be absorbed by people, and how might it affect them. So the compliance routes for RF exposure testing are SAR, or power density testing, doing a maximum permissible exposure MPE calculation, doing electromagnetic field measurements, which that's a growing area, particularly for Canada, and then also computational assessment. That again is a growing area, and it involves a lot of complex math and computer models. So you're buying an off-the-shelf radio, and we talked about modules, but what do you need to do if you're buying an off-the-shelf radio? So some people think because they bought an off-the-shelf module, they don't need to do anything, but that is wrong. Buying an off-the-shelf radio is like renting a car. Someone else might own it, but you're responsible for what you do with it. If you violate the rules, you will get in trouble. So, first off, what do you need to do when you're using an off-the-shelf radio? You still need to meet the legal requirements for all markets. So how do you do that? First off, start by looking at the data sheet to see if it has any approvals already. So not all modules have been pre-approved. Not all modules have been approved for all the markets. So, an example might be a cellular module. One manufacturer might have multiple cellular modules, and one might be only approved for North America, the FCC and ISA, and one might be only approved for EU, or they might have one that's approved for both. And so you need to pick your module with care. It can be very expensive to do original approvals for many countries. And so, maybe you want to do two different models, one model for the North America, one model for the European Union, or do you want to use just one module and that can go anywhere? That's going to be, kind of again, cost assessment, because it's going to be additional testing to do two modules, but maybe it makes more sense. Another note is if you're buying an off-the-shelf product like a laptop and incorporate it into your medical device system without making any changes to the radio, no additional radio testing should be required for the laptop, but you still need to gather the required information for the EU and include it as part of your certification. So the EU doesn't have the concept of modular approval. The product needs to meet the requirements of the Radio Equipment Directive, the RED. But they do have a similar idea. Basically, it's a radio product. So the details of that are in EG 203-367, which is a guidance document that talks about incorporating a radio that has already been tested. So basically, you as a host manufacturer, the integrator, can buy radios that have been tested to the requirements of the Radio Equipment Directive and request that report from the radio manufacturer. This means you can leverage the radio testing done by the radio manufacturer, essentially using the results from most of the testing. So things like occupied bandwidth, duty cycle, frequency, agility, those tests aren't going to be affected by being in a host product and don't need to be redone. So you are going to need to do testing for anything that could be affected by an integration into a host. So spurious emissions, spot checks of output power, spot checks of receiver sensitivity, because integration into a host can definitely affect receiver testing. And then you need to make sure you do proper paperwork, the declaration of conformity, and collect all the appropriate documentation per the RED. For the FCC, not all off-the-shelf radios have FCC approval as a module. So you want to make sure if you're integrating a radio, look at it and see that it's got proper approvals. Otherwise, it can be very expensive to to do the approvals yourself if you didn't intend to. If the radio was approved as a module, the requirements depend on how it was certified and how it will be used. So module manufacturers will have a module integration guide available to you, and that can just be a gold mine for information. It is something you definitely need to look at and read when you're purchasing a module. So reading through that, it helps limit the risk of failures, and there's less of a chance of needing certs if you're following the integration instructions. And there's more information on this on the FCC KDB 296369, which is on module authorization. So if you're integrating this module and you're making any changes that might affect radio characteristics or that degrade the emissions, that's going to require a permissive change. So permissive changes under the FCC are primarily classed as Class 1 or Class 2. A Class 1 is a change that is not going to require additional certification work, so you don't need to involve a TCB, and a Class 2 requires certification and submittal to the FCC. There's info in KDB 178919, but basically for all changes, testing needs to be done. For some changes, whether it's going to be a Class 1 with no certification work or a Class 2 with a submittal to the FCC, it's going to depend on the results of your testing. So another note is modular certifications include specific antenna types. If you're using a different antenna than what was certified, what was in the module integration guide, you're going to need to do additional certification work and additional testing. Another note is if you're integrating multiple radios, so if you're putting say a Wi-Fi chip and an RFID chip in your product, you're going to need to check emissions for simultaneous transmissions. And a good example of that is Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, both in the 2.4 gigahertz band. They can have potential interference if they're transmitting at the same time. Okay, so you also need to meet RF exposure requirements for the host with the radio in all markets. So a reminder that RF exposure can mean SAR testing, EMF testing, or calculation, but the requirements when integrating an off-the-shelf radio depend on what was done previously with that radio. So the FCC separates it into portable, mobile, and fixed, with portable being a product that's going to be less than 20 centimeters from the user. Classic example is a cell phone. And mobile is greater than 20 centimeters from a user. So an infusion pump, diagnostic cart, something like that, that's not, directly next to a user in typical use. So when you're looking at that data sheet for an approved module, is it approved for the use case? So for RF exposure, if it was approved as a module, meaning greater than 20 centimeters from a person, and you want to use it closer than 20 centimeters, you've got to do a Class 2 permissive change and then potentially do testing, evaluate it. It may require SAR, which can be quite expensive. So basically, if the module has been approved for mobile and you're using it in mobile, you can typically just use the previous data. But if it's mobile and you're changing it to portable closer to the user, that is going to require certification. So some modules have already been approved for portable use, meaning closer than 20 centimeters, but it depends on how they were certified under that grant. There is a whole bunch of details on SAR testing. You could spend an entire day on just going in depth into SAR. But basically, if you've got a module that you need to use as portable, you're going to have to really dig into that. Reach out to somebody like Element to start the discussion about what's going to be needed for that. Another important point is SAR testing for the EU and USA is different. They use the same base standard, but there's different limits and some different nuances there. And again, if you're adding multiple radios into a product, you need to check for simultaneous transmission and RF exposure from the multiple radios. If you've got two approved radios, one Bluetooth and one Wi-Fi, they both potentially are in the 2.4 gigahertz range and both might be just fine by themselves. But once you have two 2.4 gigahertz signals at the same time in close proximity to a person, it might trigger SAR testing. Okay, so you've got a medical device you released to the market, think everything's good, and then something comes along and you need to make a change. What do you need to do? So unfortunately, the classic answer, it depends. So it depends on what the change is and depends on the product. So first off, take a look at and do an EMC risk assessment. How does this change affect the medical device functions? And, will this affect the results for 60601? So you might need to, if you change a power supply for the host, that's pretty much a full retest for a medical device for -1, -2. But if you have a large system with many pieces and you change one piece of that large system, you might not need to do full testing. This is something you definitely should reach out to your local test lab to kind of discuss and see what will make sense. So the next step is evaluate how does this change the radio portion of the product. For the EU, if there are changes to the radio circuit, it depends on how the radio was previously approved. If you had to do a type examination certificate, you might have to do one again. And you may only need to do spurious emissions for testing, but again, it depends on the change. Then any immunity testing under the red is going to depend on be determined by your risk assessment. For the US and Canada, testing is required for basically any physical change to the product. The FCC says certifications only apply to units that are identical to the one certified, and they mean identical. And when you're making a change to a product, it's not should I test, but how much do I need to test? You almost assuredly are going to need to test. The only one example off the top of my head where you don't need to test is for Canada. If you're changing a model number, you do need to do certification work, but you don't need to do testing. But for the most part, if you're making a physical change, if you're changing a software, sometimes you need to do some sort of testing. So for the FCC, another example, one of our engineers tested a product that two identical products that they said the exact same except for paint color. One was painted white, one was painted black. One passed and one failed. They were the same type of paint, but just different colors, which meant a different mix, which meant one had more RF shielding than the other, and so changing that paint color caused a failure. So be aware if you're making changes like that, testing needs to be done. So again, the permissive change policy and information on that is in the FCC KDB 178919. Another example is if you want to change the antenna, add an antenna. Typically, that's going to require at least some testing. If you're changing vendors on a part, so let's say it's a ditto part, a non-radio part. So you've got your radio, you're not changing that at all, but in your medical device, you need to change a part out. Well, it probably won't require certification, but you still need to do testing to verify that you're still meeting those legal requirements of the FCC. Another example is if you're depopulating, if you got a product and you're going to pull part of it out to make a budget version. You can do that, but testing is still required. Usually it's a good idea to test both the fully populated and the depopulated version during the initial certification work because it streamlines things and going to save you money. You're going to want to reach out to your local test lab for specific guidance because this is, changes can be very complicated. So when you're coming to the test lab, what do you need to do? First, make sure nothing has changed between quoting and the start of testing. If you decide, oh, hey, we need to add another antenna, or we need to change the radio slightly, or we need to change the layout, things like that. It might be just a minor change, it might just be a paperwork change, or it might be re-quoting and a whole lot more testing. So that's something, before you walk in the door, you really want to make sure that what was quoted, what was planned during the quote and what the actual testing needs to be done is the same. And it's best to discuss this prior to the start instead of halfway into the project. Another thing is for radios, antenna port testing may be required depending on the radio and what testing is needed. So this may involve soldering a pigtail and an SMA connector onto the circuit board if it has an integrated antenna. So if there's like a chip antenna, some testing might still need to be done direct connect, so you'll need to solder onto that board to get that connection. Also, some clients ask us what do they need to do to configure the device properly for testing. Basically, how do you control the radio? So it depends on the scope. So system approvals and original approvals for modules are more complex, so they require more approval or more control compared to integrating an approved module. So first off, you need to be able to control the data rate and frequency band. So for example, for Wi-Fi, you need to be able to set the channel. So for 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi, set it to channels 1, 6, or 11, or change it to 5 gigahertz, set it to 20, 40, or 80 megahertz bandwidth, 6 or 54 megabits per second, things like that. If it's a frequency hopper like Bluetooth, you want to be able to set it to a single frequency, basically turn hopping off, change it, set the radio to maximum throughput. It's nice to be able to control duty cycle. So things with very low duty cycle, it can require additional testing time, additional cost if you can't control that duty cycle and increase it. Ideally, it would be around 100%, but not having a super low duty cycle is important for testing. You also need to be able to put a radio into receive-only mode where the radio is powered on but not transmitting. For cellular, the radio also needs to be able to communicate with a base station. This means using a SIM card from the lab. If you're using an eSIM, basically a digital SIM, you need to make sure you can work with the lab to set it up with the base station. Wireless coexistence, ANSI C63.27. So many people think that basic testing like that in 60601-1-2 or 3149 addresses wireless coexistence, but they do not. As previously discussed, -1-2 is focused on basic safety and essential performance, so some medical devices don't need to monitor radio performance. The 3149 series has exclusion bands for the receive frequencies, so performance is not required on that band. And how exclusion bands are used has changed in the past few years, but regular immunity testing still doesn't address in-band interference from digitally modulated signals. Some ANSI radio standards, testing the radio directly, have requirements similar to coexistence, like receiver blocking, adjacent channel selectivity or sensitivity, or adjacent channel or adjacent signal selectivity or adaptivity. But these tests use CW or additive white Gaussian noise and not real-life signals. So for 6327, think of a typical medical care environment like a hospital or clinic. A hospital, you're going to have Wi-Fi for the staff. You're going to have Wi-Fi for the patients. You could potentially have people using a cell phone as a hotspot. You're going to have 2.4 gigahertz RFID, Bluetooth, Zigbee, potentially even more in that 2.4 gigahertz band. So 63.27 provides a method for evaluation of devices to these signals. Annex A in .27 details specifics for a few radios, but the standard provides methods for use on any radio. Testing is split into 3 tiers, 1, 2, and 3, with tier 1 being the most stringent. A test plan is required prior to testing. It's going to be separate from your 60601 test plan because the risks are different, the tests are significantly different. So TIR69, AAMI TIR69 lays out the risk analysis for coexistence. You're going to need to identify functional wireless performance and key performance indicators, things like jitter, bitrate, throughput, etc. How does that affect overall performance of the medical device based on your wireless performance? So failure criteria need to be determined by a manufacturer during the risk assessment, and it's not something a test lab can really do without in-depth knowledge of the medical device, which we're just not going to have. So in 6327, Annex A is normative and provides specific guidance for the unintended signals in the setting of the EUT. For Wi-Fi, Tier 3 requires a single adjacent channel test with the EUT on channel 6 and interfering signals at 1 or 11. Tier 2 adds a co-channel test, so essentially the EUT is on channel 6 and an interfering signal also on channel 6. And then Tier 1 requires all of these and also adds a test with both the adjacent channels, so and LT adjacent bands. So EUT on band 6 or on channel 6 and interfering signals on channels 1 and 11, and then the EUT on channel 1 and LTE signal just out of that frequency, out of that band. So different interference types. This diagram shows some potential sources of interference. So the red signal on the right is the intended signal. In this case, you can assume it is a 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. Next to it, the other red signal is another Wi-Fi channel, and the shaded overlap there is adjacent channel interference. This is why most Wi-Fi 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi routers in the U.S. use channels 1, 6, and 11. they are the ones that overlap the least. The green signal is in-band interference, and here could be a Bluetooth signal. And while Bluetooth hops in and out of each channel, it still can cause coexistence issues. And then the last potential source of interference is the blue out-of-band signal, say an 800 megahertz cellular device. It isn't close enough in frequency to cause an issue with the intended Wi-Fi signal, but the third harmonic sits right in that 2.4 gigahertz band. And even a device that's fully compliant with radio regulations could still cause interference. There are 4 test methods described in .27. There's conducted testing with the radios connected to each other via combiners, splitters, and attenuators, and then 3 radiated methods, a dual chamber method, a single chamber method, and an open area test. Choice of method is up to the user of the standard and should be chosen working with your test lab. So here you can see a basic setup for the radiated method. On the left, you've got the EUT communicating with a companion device on the top right, and then a level setting antenna on the bench next to the EUT. The right photo shows the interfering signal coming from a antenna radiating onto the EUT. The companion device is out of the direct beam of the antenna to try to limit interference with it. Transmit power for the EUT should be reasonable worst case, so you don't want it maxed out, but you also don't want it on noise floor. Testing can also be done with real-world hardware, the interference source, but that adds complexity to the setup, and level setting is much more complicated, as well as accurately gauging receive power at EUT. So here's an example of interfering signals. On the left is a 20 megahertz Wi-Fi, 40 megahertz Wi-Fi at channel with co-channel interference, and on the right is 5 gigahertz, 40 megahertz Wi-Fi with 2 adjacent channel interference signals. From this testing, you can determine the IU ratio, the ratio of the intended signal to the unintended signal, the interfering signal, essentially finding the minimum delta between these 2 signal levels for proper operation of your device. This value can then be used to estimate the likelihood of wireless coexistence, essentially basing your evaluation of the signals your device will see so that you can do proper risk analysis. If you'd like more in-depth information on wireless coexistence, you can read the feature article I wrote for April's issue of In Compliance magazine. So emerging topics, what's new in medical device testing? So I previously mentioned the first 3 topics here, but I'm going to just briefly touch on them. The first is 4-2. So we're seeing a lot more pushback from the FDA on products that have not been evaluated to 4-2, meaning medical device manufacturers, as medical device manufacturers, you'll want to investigate applying that to your device during testing on the first round instead of having to come back or reevaluate after submitting to the FDA. RFID immunity, so I mentioned the edition 4.1 is intended to replace the requirement to do AIM testing, but we've heard from people that they've seen susceptibility to AIM, but not to the edition 4.1. So they're similar levels and signals, but the modulation is different and different results are being reported. And then coexistence, I just covered it, but the FDA, in the past, it was focused on what was in Annex A, which is a Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and DEC, those 3 radios, which have detailed requirements. But coexistence, now we're seeing everybody needs to be evaluated either through risk analysis or testing for any type of radio. So, RFID, inductive, anything needs at least some sort of evaluation. Additionally, the FCC is starting to look at electronic article surveillance testing, so it's something we're seeing requests from, even though there's no standard out there. A standard is in development, and I'm on the working group for that, and the final draft is in progress. It will likely go up for a vote in SC8 in the next few months, and then full committee as well. I expect publication in probably Q2 of 2025, and then adoption by the FDA soon after as the recognized consensus standard. And then another very much growing topic is susceptibility to 5G NR and wireless power transfer. Both of these radio technologies are becoming commonplace, and wireless power transfer from cell phones to electric vehicles is now in the field and could potentially affect medical devices. The FDA is asking for evaluation of these threats, but there's no published standards on testing for them. Element, we've internally developed a test method to test the susceptibility of medical devices to these threats. So if you're interested in that, if you've got questions from the FDA, or if you need more information, please reach out. So Sonia, I think we've got another poll question here.
Yes, we do. We have our final poll question. I'm going to launch it now, and then once the poll question is done, we'll get right into a quick Q&A before our time is up. Okay, so here's our last poll question, everyone. Has this webinar improved your understanding of EMC and radio compliance regulations for medical devices? Please go ahead and select from below. I need more information. I can go beyond the basics. I think I got it. I already knew all of this. So please go ahead and cast your vote. Okay, that looks like it's the majority of our audience. I'm going to close the polls now so we can squeeze in at least one question from our members of our audience. So let me close the polls now. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating. Okay, and here are the results. 20% said I need more information. 53% said I can go beyond the basics, and 27% says I think I've got it, and 0% said I already knew all of this. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in our final poll question. And now we'll get into the Q&A. I'm not sure if our webcams are working, but let's see if we can try to launch it here. Hi, everyone. And we get David there. So remember, as a reminder to our audience, please send in your questions by using that questions window, and we'll try to address your questions during the time we have together. But as we notice here now, we only have 3 minutes, so we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to say that if we don't answer your questions, the team at Element will follow up with you. All right, so let's start with this first question here. It says here, how long does it take to develop a test plan?
It depends a little bit on what you're doing. So, really, for what I covered today, there's 2 test plans that you need to look at: it wireless coexistence and then the basic medical device EMC. So it depends a little bit on the complexity of your device. So for coexistence, if you just got a basic Wi-Fi radio in there, or a Bluetooth radio, a lot of the information is already in 63.27. And it's going to focus more on, doing that risk analysis and looking at AAMI TIR69. So, I can't give hey, it's going to take a week, but less complex products it isn't going to take as long. Same thing on the medical device side. The 60601-1-2. If you got a simple standalone medical product versus something that's got a half dozen different standalone devices combined together, a test plan for that is going to take a lot longer. So, I can't give a firm number, but unfortunately, it depends.
Okay, and I'm going to squeeze one last question in. When do I need to retest my device if I make changes for future models, as audience members asking?
So, that goes back to, I cover that a little bit, that it depends on what the change is, but typically, before you release the product, if you're making a change before it goes public, you need to do testing. If it affects the radio, you need to do testing to ensure you're still meeting the compliance requirements and certification requirements.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for squeezing all of that in. We've reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. And remember, if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Element will follow up with you after this presentation. And if you have any further questions, direct them to the email address and the phone numbers you see there on your screen. Thank you, everyone, for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. I'm going to share with you in a few moments today's event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues, so they may register for the recording here as well. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our webinars. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speaker today, David, for his time here. And before I forget, get even more out of today's presentation by downloading the supporting material that we have for you available under the Handouts tab, and it's a PDF of today's presentation. Okay, we hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at XTalks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye, everyone.